Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very humbled to be asked to give this annual lecture. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. As Mr. Singh said, I'm not an astrologer. I can't tell the future, and I don't claim to tell the future. What historians do is look at patterns. And that's what I'm going to try to do with globalization. Globalization is actually a good subject to look at patterns, because one of the few things we know for certain is that the past has seen globalization waves. And it's a parlor game for historians to say when globalization began. You can go back to the Roman Empire, Genghis Khan, the Spanish conquest of the New World, whatever. What we do know for sure is that there is a massive wave of globalization beginning in the 19th century. We know too that that is dramatically reversed. And that's the story I want to talk about today. That's a graph I actually show to my MBA students in the second year course I teach. And for some of them who have no sense of history, it's quite shocking. It's a graph which shows the world globalizing at an enormous extent, that falling apart, and then a process of reglobalization. And as you can tell from that graph, I think we're now in a period of de-globalization, although I don't know its contours or depth. And there's lots of similar schematics one could have to illustrate the same point. That's a schematic of capital mobility. It becomes incredibly easy to move money around the world before World War I. That almost completely disintegrates, and then we resume this kind of mobility afterwards. Those are illustrative graphs. If you graph what harder data we have, we see a slightly more nuanced picture, but the same picture. The first wave of globalization going up to around about World War I, then it falls apart. And for something like 40 years, foreign multinational investment is highly subdued. 30 years, exports are highly subdued. And then in the last 30 years, it's ridden up to a higher level. So what causes globalization? Actually, two things cause globalization: technology and policy. Let me talk about those. Why did the world first globalize in the 19th century? It globalizes because suddenly it's possible to move around the world much more than it was in the past. So before 1800, the speed you could move depended on how fast you ran, if you had a horse, if you had an elephant, or if you had a sailing ship. That's it. That's how fast you can go. From the middle of the 19th century, that changes. It changes from the 1830s with trains, steamboats. That's the Suez Canal. 1890s, we see the spread of bicycles, and in the 1900s, the first automobiles. So suddenly, and for the first time ever in the world, you could move faster than an animal or yourself, which was extraordinary. And that's driving globalization. More important, I think, than even that is the communications revolution. That's a spread of the telegraph. The telegraph is the most remarkable innovation ever. And it suddenly enables information to move very, very quickly. You can't completely see that, but that's showing telegraph lines built over the Atlantic and connecting this and that. And the darker the area, that's the area connected by telegraph. It's very tied to imperial patterns. The imperial regimes built the telegraph to communicate. And late 19th century too, we see the telephone happening. Technology is crucial. People had been, as I said, there'd been previous waves of communication, of globalization, but it was very hard to sustain that because you can't communicate and you can't travel. It's just very difficult. The building of this transport and communications infrastructure enables more permanent types of trade and capital flows to happen. It enables the South or Asia to be turned into producers of commodities which go to the industrialized West, Western goods to come back. Communications is crucial in this, in the depth of globalization. So in the 18th century, it took months for information to reach Mumbai from London. Months. You're on a boat. By 1870, any information from London can reach Mumbai in 30 minutes. That's a huge transformation. That's the biggest transformation we've ever seen in communications. Much more impressive and fundamental than the web. What does that do? It does many things. It enables for the first time global capital markets to exist, because now information can spread fast between capital markets. And it enables the creation of the multinational enterprise, a firm operating in multiple countries. That was very difficult to do before you could communicate at such a distance. So technology is like really important. Policy is equally important. Suddenly in the 19th century, you see policies being put in place which make it possible to move around, to trade and to invest. The gold standard enables people to move money around in a way they'd never done before, linking the value of currencies to the value of gold. You can invest anywhere in the world. Nobody cares if you're a foreigner. That was pretty remarkable. But the second part of the overhead, I think, is the sort of the darker picture. Globalization is also imposed on large amounts of the world. Western imperialists take over much of the world, and you have to globalize. The most, one of the key cases was China, which fiercely resisted globalization. It's forced to import opium. Military power is forced against the Chinese to break open their economy, to globalize. So a lot of globalization is coercive, and nowhere is that more important than in United States and in the Americas, where the indigenous people are expropriated, thrown out of their lands for white people to come and settle and grow crops. So globalization was forceful. It was a forced globalization. And some of the paradoxes of this are most clearly seen, of course, in the case of India. India undergoes a forced globalization shock because the British impose free trade on India. The result is the handicraft industry is decimated as cheap manufacturing goods come in. India loses its sovereignty. Resistance is subdued by military force. That's the coercive dimension of globalization. India also gets benefits. It gets corporate law, which is soon better than English corporate law. It gets stability, and it had had chaos when the Mughal Empire disintegrated. And it gets a global language, English. Cities which are linked to the global world, like Bombay, Calcutta, particular groups, classically the Parsis, which are linked to the global world, flourish in that world. Other parts of India don't don't flourish. So what was the role of business in all of this? The role of business is quite crucial. So all that transport and communications infrastructure I talked about is put in place by firms. Firms build all the telegraph lines. Firms do all the technological interventions. Firms spread across borders in an amazing way. Firms develop the basic techniques of multinational manufacturing and marketing. And firms spread diffusion of spread products around the world. I give the example there of the Singer sewing machine, which I think is an important example. Singer comes out of a very small company in the United States. It spreads over the world, and by 1914, 90% of sewing machines are around the world. If you think are controlled by Singer, if you think globalization is spectacularly new now, in case of Singer shows, it's not. There's some of its images, and it's got a clear view of its importance and its role in the world. That's the scaling of its biggest markets. Singer becomes highly globalized by 1914. Its biggest market is in Russia. It's not in the United States. And you can see it's all over the world in a spectacular extent. What's interesting about Singer is what it does. Singer figures out the rules how to take an expensive piece of machinery to poor people. We think that's a relatively new thing now. It's absolutely not. How do you sell a sewing machine, which is expensive, to people? Singer systematically works through basic principles. It first establishes retail stores, and I put the example of Apple up there, but it's exactly the same. It shows its products to people. It then invents the concept of hire purchase. If people can't buy the good, then you lend them on credit. It then develops the fundamental principles of direct selling. It sends people out, thousands of people, to sell the product, often increasingly to illiterate people, and to get the money back. And as a multinational organization, it innovates constantly. So many of the innovations come not from the United States, but from where it's operating, Britain or in Russia in particular. So Singer discovers, as I said, how to sell complex machinery to poor or illiterate people, and that the machinery transforms the nature of work, the nature of many women's lifestyles, as a matter of fact, globally. All of that, I think, is a sign of how important business was in globalization. Why does globalization end? Globalization ends, this wave of globalization ends because of shocks, world wars, and the Great Depression were huge shocks to the system. But as I write there, shocks do not end globalization. What ends globalization is how people respond to shocks. And it seems to me clearly what had happened was that global capitalism had lost legitimacy. What happened in the interwar years is a sentiment change. It's sentiment change which ends globalization. It's sentiment change. What makes people shift from thinking globalization is good to making it bad? So let me walk you through quickly some of the warning lights before the global economy collapsed in the 1920s. 6 warning lights were happening. And you may perhaps think they appear strangely familiar. Globalization increases economic growth. Economic growth consumes resources and starts to damage and consume the environment. In the 19th century, as industrialization took hold, there was a growing environmental crisis. There's massive water and smoke pollution. There's massive deforestation. There's a massive spread of health disease, including tooth decay. This period sees growing alarm at environmental crisis and growing attempts to form international efforts to control the environmental crisis. Globalization enables people to catch up, backward countries to catch up. In the 19th century, Britain was the foremost industrial power, but Germany takes advantage of globalization to catch up. As a country catches up, it wants to set the rules. And by the 1900s, the British and the German navies were competing already for who's going to set the rules. Globalization enables people, new sets of powers to take hold. People lose out in globalization. In the first globalization, one of the biggest set of losers was Islam, many Islamic communities. From the late 19th century, we see the growth of militant Islamic movements fighting the Western powers in numerous geographies, motivated by very strong ideological views that the world was sick and the Western world was hostile to them. Globalization enables people to move countries. At a certain stage, as people met countries, people started hating people, foreign people. Suddenly we see in the early 20th century countries of immigration like the United States and Australia introducing race-based immigration rules. They liked some people and they didn't like other people. The United States becomes, I give the case there, the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was an organization formed after the American Civil War. It collapses. During World War I in the 1920s, the Klan becomes incredibly powerful with 5 million active Americans crusading against African Americans, Jews, and Catholics. Unprecedented. No one could have imagined that that would happen in the United States, which is a country of immigration. And you can take that in other geographies. I give the case of the Ottoman Empire, which was the most cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic place you could ever want. And it completely disintegrates with massacres of Armenians, Greeks in particular. Nobody could have imagined that. As globalization takes hold, wait a minute. I need some guy to move on my PowerPoint. As globalization takes, next is a good idea. As globalization takes hold, we saw political units disintegrate. So the 19th century world had been had big multi-ethnic units. Many of them fall apart in this period. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, even Britain, split into different units. People had come together, so they felt more tribal. They didn't want to be integrated. Actually, they started to hate each other. And behind all of that was globalization encourages winners, and there are also a ton of losers. The biggest losers in the 19th century were India and China. According to our latest data, in 1820, they account for 1/2 of the world GDP. By 1914, they account for 15% of world GDP. That's an extreme example, but there are many other examples. We often think Latin America has always been unequal. It hasn't. The latest statistics we have show that inequality only rose in the 19th century. It rose with globalization because people who owned land were able to enormously benefit from globalization because they became suppliers of primary commodities to the West. Landowners got rich and a lot of other people got poor. There are other winners and losers too if you stand away from the first global economy. Men won, women lost. The gender position of women deteriorates in this position, in this situation. The whiter your skin, the better you did. The darker your skin, the worse you did. And that's from the economist Piketty. In developed countries, we see a very clear pattern of inequality rising. By 1928, the top 1% share of pre-tax income in the United States had risen to that level, 23%, incredibly high. As you can see from the map, as the world deglobalizes, inequality collapses. Then, as the world starts to reglobalize in the 90s, 80s, inequality shoots up again, and we're just at the level we were in 1928. Now, massive inequality. Was capitalism, was business the problem here? Well, again, there are two sides of every coin. Business drove this amazing wave of wealth creation that we see in this period. But the thing about business is that it tends to reinforce trends rather than counter them. So business worked to make some people very rich and some locations very rich, and it worked in the opposite direction if you weren't part of that successful story. And for sure, foreign companies are active in the global world as it was then. I put the example of the Guggenheims. There are wonderful Guggenheim museums in New York now. Where do they come from? They come from exploiting impoverished workers in Mexico and in Latin America and blowing out mountains. And they transfer wealth to create wonderful art museums in New York. And that's how the system worked. And I have endless debate with my MBAs whether what we think about that as a matter of fact, because art and museums are treasures. But nevertheless, the process is clear. Globalization proved, in this period, remarkably unable to spread growth around the world. For some reason, modern economic growth remains rather concentrated in certain locations. It proved very hard for local firms to catch up. They tend to get stripped out rather than catch up. And so we see before 1914 only a few locations, Bombay actually, Japan, some of Argentina, northern Mexico had created modern firms. Most people can't catch up in this world at all. And meanwhile, business had also worked to diminish the reputation of capitalism. I mean, I've given a few examples there, but they're worth rehearsing. Jardine Matheson, the proud Scottish company, had been central to opium smuggling in China. Western firms held concessions which paid no tax all over Africa and Asia. When the Nazis came upon Germany in the 1930s, the business system almost entirely collaborated. Only one foreign company left Nazi Germany, only one, and it had hundreds of the world's biggest multinationals in it. One company left. And we could go through these episodes of reputational damage. Does all business behave like that? No. In this period, you have a number of people wanting and arguing for a different role for business. I give the case of Andrew Carnegie up there. There's his picture. He creates the first charitable foundation in 1911. He writes something called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he says, making himself very unpopular, it's wonderful to become rich. Becoming rich drives innovation. But you then have a responsibility for your society. So he said, also, by the way, don't give any of your money to your children. Give it back to society. That is the gospel of wealth. That's the responsibility of being allowed. The license to make wealth is also the license to give back. Does that become the mainstream in the United States? Absolutely not. But it does create a tradition of people who want to give back. And there's my own institution, and there's the dean in the 1920s, Dean Donham. That's the Harvard Business School being built in 1927, by the way. Dean Donham is an interesting dean. By the 1920s, he was extremely concerned about inequality in the United States. He's extremely concerned about what business, the responsibility of business. And I put a couple of quotes up there, but you can see the general point. He says, business has grown very big, and it has to recognize its responsibilities for the future of civilization. The next quote, business is responsible. It should be adding to the security and the happiness of people. This is the Harvard Business School dean. What's motivating him is huge concern that if business didn't do that, governments will intervene and do it for them because there's too many people resenting business. He's the guy who establishes my chair, the Isidore Straus Professorship, because he thought teaching future business leaders history was among your best bets to get them to act responsibly in future. He's not the only guy who does that. That's a guy called Shigeru Ichi, who's one of the most important Japanese business leaders in the late 19th century. He's an amazing venture capitalist. He found 600 companies, 600. He also very articulately makes the case for what we would now call stakeholder capitalism. He says very clearly in a system called Gappon Shugi, if you know Japanese, that business has a responsibility for society, for stakeholders. He's not talking about CSR. He's talking about every single thing a business person does should be contributing to society. As I said, he's a hugely successful Japanese capitalist. He's the founder of the modern Japanese financial system, founder of 600 companies. So he's not some sort of wishy-washy sort of guy. He knows exactly what he's doing, and one of the things he's doing is the system, if it becomes too unfair, will collapse. He's still talking about that in the 1920s when the Japanese system is becoming unstable and will soon lead to a catastrophic military regime which will wage war all over Asia. And it's not just Japan. I mean, I don't need to tell you about Gandhi and Bajaj, but what they're talking about is trustee capitalism and the sustainability of systems. Nobody listens to Dean Donham or these other guys or Shigeru Ichi, and the world does in fact deglobalize. We see a sentiment shift whereby people believe that the state is the instrument to create social justice. And everywhere across systems, from India to the United States, the state in various ways takes over issues of education, redistribution, everything else. We see massive restrictions on capital flows, people flows, and trade flows. That's what drives all those collapse in trade and of capital movements. Governments shut them out. They say, no way, guys. You're not going to do it. You're not going to invest. So policy drives de-globalization. And I emphasize that because it is policy that drives de-globalization. Policy, not technology. So I often hear, or sometimes hear, less these days, I'm told that social technologies, Facebook, Twitter and everything, in that world we can't possibly de-globalize. And I think that's complete rubbish. And just to illustrate that point, during the era of de-globalization, the world had never been so connected. You can fly all around. You could never do that before. You could see people on cinema and on television and on movies. You could never do that before. You could talk to people. That's a new range of technologies, making it very easy to communicate. And the more people saw each other, the more they disliked each other. And the more they fought each other, which is very sobering, I think. Let me, and I'll kind of finish quite soon, you'll be relieved to know. Now we talk a lot about de-globalization, and it's important, I think, to look at what de-globalization actually is. First of all, these global technologies don't go away. What happens is how they are used. They're used by governments against globalization, not to support it. In Germany, the Nazi regime was at the frontier of the most advanced use of communications technology. They just use it in order to murder millions of people and wage war on it. They use a technology which people actually had thought was liberating and a force for democracy. They use it in the most brutal way. You say the same story about the Soviet Union and communist China, if you want to. So technologies are politically neutral. And as a matter of fact, most communications technologies are actually quite dangerous if you have an authoritarian government. They're not liberating at all, as a number of countries today clearly demonstrate. De-globalization in this period also doesn't mean the end of movements of trade or capital or something. What you actually get is a fragmented view, fragmented mini-globalizations. In the West, you had currency areas, and trade and money would move in the currency areas. And you get radical alternatives to liberal globalization. You had fascist globalization. By the 1940s, the Nazis are holding fashion shows for fashion models from all the fascist countries, whether it be Italy or whatever. So the whole paraphernalia of a global world was created among the fascists, and the collaboration, of course, between Imperial Japan and Germany, whatever. And you get a communist global world. For a time, China and Russia and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were united in a global world. And India is actually part of that world. After China spins off, India is a huge supply of entertainment to the Soviet Union, Bollywood. There's a huge amount of technology flows going between the two regions. So de-globalization, in a way, is a misnomer, because when liberal globalization falls apart, what you get is mini-globalizations happening. Is deglobalization a bad thing? And I think the answer is also quite interesting. I mean, we're often spoken of as something we're afraid of. And I think partly rightly, and maybe wrongly. So the problem about deglobalization is that it's caused by people who hate other people. And so in this period, it produced massive wars, persecution, hatred of other people. And that's the scary part of deglobalization. But as the graph I already showed you, it also produces a number of other things. There's a sharp fall of inequality, and there's that's the map, that's US, UK, United States. They all show the same patterns. Inequality dramatically falls in a deglobalized world, and then dramatically rises in the 1980s with deregulation, the Reagan Revolution, and the growth of globalization, Thatcher story. So societies became more equal. Deglobalization is accompanied by a massive social improvement in the lives of many people in the non-Western world. That's just the literacy rates in India. The British leave India as a terribly illiterate society. India in the planning era, the licensed Raj era, really sees quite very strong advance in social indicators. You can tell the same story in the Soviet Union. And deglobalization actually allowed firms from many countries to catch up with Western incumbents. The story of Japan and South Korea is a story of people catching up between high tariff barriers and all sorts of protectionism, and they were able to grow their businesses. Indian IT services begins in pretty much the same way when IBM flees the country because of government policies, creating scope for Indian entrepreneurs to build a market presence. And by the time liberalization has occurred, the IT services industry is fairly secure. And you can cover that across sectors. Does globalization end global business? Not at all either. But what happened in this period was that global firms became very local firms, because they all had to collaborate very closely with local norms, local governments. So I give the example there of Unilever by the 1970s had a huge investment in chemicals because the government wanted chemicals. It was hugely invested in the family planning program because the government wanted family planning. It's exporting shoes to the Soviet Union, which was no business of Unilever whatsoever, because the government had export targets. So multinationals have to adjust in a deglobalized period to highly regulated economies. So as I began by saying, I'm not a not a fortune teller, but I think there are some interesting lessons from history. What I take away first is there is nothing linear about globalization. We can think it's a linear process. There's no evidence it ever has been. Maybe it will be, I doubt it. Globalization is a secular process, and it's a secular process for particular reasons. Globalization, almost by definition, rewards winners. If it rewards winners, there are going to be losers. Globalization encourages people to know more about the others. So the losers know they're losing, and that's a huge issue. The problem, the key thing is the sentiments, how people feel about globalization. So in the interwar years and through the 50s and 60s, there was a massive sentiment change. People basically believed globalization was bad, and alternatives were better. So if you're looking for when deglobalization occurs, it's when sentiments shift. It's when people start saying, we're going to build walls, or we're going to stop restrictions, or we're going to renegotiate trade agreements. It's when the sentiment changes, you know that there's a paradigm shift, and you know that much more than any other, any more things. As I said, it's sad. I mean, we often think deglobalization is a sad thing, and I think it depends on what lens you're looking at. Deglobalization in the 20th century brought many benefits to many people. It's also, unfortunately, extremely dangerous because the same sentiments which close down a system are likely to cause political turmoil. As you can probably tell from my presentation, I think the parallels between the 1920s, the early 20th century, and today are extremely upsetting and make one feel extremely uncomfortable about what's going to happen next. But as any good historian will tell you, nothing is ever inevitable. And as this is like a business history lecture, I go back to the role of business, and I go back to the role of what my old dean said. At a time of growing crisis in the world in the 1920s, he said, basically, politicians have failed us all, and business leaders have to step up and take greater responsibility. They didn't, and the United States gets 50 years of tight regulation as a result, the New Deal and going forward. So if there's any lesson, I think, from history, it's the responsibility of business leaders to bear Donham's words at mind and think about ways where we can create more winners than losers. That's it. Thank you.